Something really fundamental is shifting in the North American economy. And it's not happening because of some big public announcement or a grand treaty. No, it's happening quietly, behind the scenes, in corporate boardrooms and on factory floors. And it's all being kicked off by a series of really aggressive trade policies coming out of Washington. So let's get right into this incredible story of unintended consequences and the rise of a new, much more assertive Canada.
And it all started with this one sentence, kind of buried in a corporate press release. For decades, the logic was just simple. If you sell a car in Canada, you build it in the United States. Well, Subaru's quiet announcement didn't just break a 36-year-old tradition, it basically cracked the entire foundation of North American manufacturing.
I mean, on the surface, this makes zero sense, right? Why would you add thousands of miles of ocean shipping to what was already a super efficient supply chain? Well, the answer reveals a whole new economic reality, one where political risks now cost way more than logistics. So let's really dig in and unravel how a trade policy could backfire this spectacularly.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. We're going to start with Subaru's shocking U-turn, then expose the tariff backfire that caused it. After that, we'll look at the broader pattern of resistance, check out Canada's political crossroads, and finally, explore what it all means for this new North American order.
All right, first up, Subaru's shocking U-turn. Now, to really get how radical this decision was, you have to understand the system it completely overturned. And I gotta tell you, this wasn't just some minor tweak. This was the end of a long, mutually beneficial partnership that defined the auto industry for a whole generation.
So, for more than 30 years, since 1989, Subaru's plant down in Lafayette, Indiana was the model of continental efficiency. Foresters and Outbacks from both American and Canadian customers just rolled off the very same assembly line. This was exactly the dream of trade deals like NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. They were built to create this deeply integrated supply chain where everything just flowed seamlessly across the border. For 36 years, that was the gold standard.
And then, boom. Almost overnight, the whole thing just stopped making sense. That simple, elegant math that the entire industry was built on was shattered by this new, totally unpredictable variable. The cost of building a Subaru in Indiana for a customer up in Toronto suddenly became more expensive and a heck of a lot riskier than building that same car halfway around the world in Japan.
So you gotta ask, what on earth could cause a shift this big? I mean, it wasn't a failure in logistics or a sudden change in what customers wanted. Nope. It was the direct and totally unintended consequence of a deliberate U.S. trade strategy.
Just take a look at these numbers. When that second wave of tariffs hit, costs just went through the roof. 25% on auto parts and a massive 50% on steel and aluminum. So suddenly, all the Canadian steel, aluminum, and batteries that were being used in that Indiana plant became way too expensive. And to make matters worse, Canada started threatening its own retaliatory tariffs on finished cars coming from the U.S. And this is where it gets really ironic. The whole point of these tariffs was to punish companies for building things outside the U.S. and to force them to bring production back home. But the actual result? It made building inside the United States totally radioactive for any company that wanted to sell to a market like Canada. It actually pushed them to create supply chains that bypassed America altogether.
And all this has basically created a brand new term you're hearing in the corporate world, political volatility. Think of it like a new kind of risk tax. It means that a single announcement from the White House can change the cost of your entire supply chain overnight. And as economists will tell you, you just can't plan huge multi-year production cycles on a foundation that's that unstable.
Meanwhile, just north of the border, Canada went in the complete opposite direction. While the U.S. was embracing unpredictability, Canada's government, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, pretty much weaponized predictability. They built their entire industrial strategy around stable trade deals, long-term tax credits, and a very clear public message of no tariff surprises here.
And really, nothing sums it up better than this quote from Subaru's own CFO. When he was asked why they made the switch, the answer was just brutally simple. It wasn't about labor costs, it wasn't about shipping times, it was about being able to see a clear path forward. And that stability, that's become Canada's single greatest competitive advantage. Okay, so you might be thinking, this is just one company, right? Well, not exactly. The Subaru decision wasn't a one-off at all. It was just the most visible example of a much bigger pattern of resistance and realignment that's happening all across the continent. It really kicked off with a story that honestly hit Canada like an earthquake, the fight for the future of the Stellantis auto plant in Brampton, Ontario. This was a plant that for decades had been a real symbol of the country's industrial might. So Stellantis announced they were shifting production of its Jeep Compass to Illinois.
and taking 3,000 Canadian jobs with them. And this came after the company had already accepted about $15 billion in Canadian and Ontario subsidies to retool that very plant, with the promise to keep jobs in Canada for a decade. In Parliament, they flat out called it a betrayal.
You know, in the past, something like this might have been seen as, well, a national humiliation, but not this time. In 2025, it became a national awakening. The shock turned into resolve. It was a turning point where Canada's industrial policy went from being defensive and reactive to something way more assertive and, frankly, protective of its own interests.
So Ottawa's response was incredibly fast and super specific. They immediately announced that any future subsidy contracts would have ironclad job retention clauses. They added clawback provisions, which means they can take their money back if a company moves jobs because of U.S. tariffs. And they fast-tracked billions for new electric vehicle plants to build a totally self-sufficient supply chain. The message couldn't have been clearer. If you want our money, you build here, period.
And get this, while all this drama was unfolding in the auto sector, another fight was brewing thousands of miles away on the West Coast. This time, it was over Canada's most critical resource, energy. And a local dispute quickly became a matter of national energy sovereignty.
And what this created was this really fascinating energy paradox. On one side, you have U.S. tariffs on steel and copper, slowing down America's own grid upgrades and green energy projects. This made the U.S. even more dependent on importing clean hydropower from Canada. But then, when a Canadian power company tried to lock in a 30-year export deal to Washington state, a powerful coalition of local communities, businesses, and the Tla'amin First Nation all rose up to block it. Their argument? Canada should keep that power for itself.
And the stakes here for the U.S., they are incredibly high. The Department of Energy is already warning that Americans could be facing up to 800 hours of blackouts a year by 2030. The U.S. was literally banking on that Canadian hydropower to fill the gap. Now the very policy that was designed to make America stronger is encouraging its most vital energy partner to just hold on to what it has.
So as you can imagine, all this external pressure didn't just stay in the boardroom. It exploded onto the political scene inside Canada, forcing the entire country to a political crossroads.
On one side, you have the conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, who framed this whole crisis, especially the Stellantis job losses, as a direct failure of the current government. His argument was that Prime Minister Carney's administration was just too weak in its negotiations and failed to protect Canadian workers from American pressure.
And on the other side, Prime Minister Carney fired right back, framing his budget not as a reaction to all this, but as a proactive $90 billion generational investment plan. His vision is to build up Canadian resilience through new infrastructure, clean energy, and a real industrial strategy, basically trying to shield the country from all the chaos happening south of the border.
And this table really lays out the two completely different ways they're looking at this. Poilievre is focused inward. He's blaming a domestic industrial carbon tax for hurting affordability, and he offers a simple solution: axe the tax. Carney, though, is looking outward. He's arguing the real threat to your wallet is the economic chaos from Washington's tariffs, and his solution is a massive investment plan and a Buy Canadian policy to build up self-reliance.
And to back up his side of the argument, Carney's government points to numbers like this one. Economists estimate that the U.S. tariff blitz is already costing Canada roughly 1.8% of its GDP. That's about $50 billion a year. That's a huge number, and it really reframes the debate from being about a domestic tax to being about a fight against a massive external economic shock.
Okay, so what does this all add up to? Where does this leave us? Well, a corporate U-turn, a national awakening, and a political firestorm have all led to the birth of a new North American order, one where Canada is transforming from a junior partner into a truly sovereign economic power.
This really shows you the chain reaction step by step. It all starts with the U.S. tariff pressure, which creates massive uncertainty. In response, global corporations start hedging their bets, rewiring their supply chains to get away from that U.S. political risk. This forces a Canadian policy response, a hard pivot to stability and strategic protectionism. And the final result? A new sovereign stance, where Canada is no longer just a dependable supplier, but a selective power that chooses its partners very carefully.
And maybe this is the most telling sign of all. The new question being asked in boardrooms from Tokyo to Stuttgart is no longer, how do we use our U.S. base to serve Canada? Instead, they're asking this. And that's a fundamental rewiring of global business logic that was, frankly, unthinkable just a few years ago.
At the end of the day, the old assumption that Canada needed the U.S. market more than the U.S. needed Canada, it's just been shattered.
What these recent events have taught Canada is that it doesn't need to beg for access anymore. It has the leverage to build its own options and chart its own course. And all this leaves us with one final, really big question. The U.S. policy was designed to assert dominance, but it has accidentally created a more determined, more independent neighbor. And for the first time in a century, the world is waiting to see what Canada does next, not what Washington will allow it to do. The long-term consequences of that shift are only just beginning to unfold.